Welcome to the place where people of faith find real answers. We believe women deserve more than just religious band-aids for their most difficult and destructive relationships. And now for today's episode of Relationship Truth Unfiltered. Hey everyone, Julie Sedenko here. You know those moments in life when everything you thought you knew gets turned upside down? Today's guest lived through it. Her story will make you think differently about love, trust, and what it really means to be strong and resilient. Leah is a little different from our usual guest because she's never been married. She was well on her way when, well, I'll just let her tell you the story. Leah, welcome.
Thank you, Julie. I'm very honored to be here. I really enjoy this podcast.
We just spent, I think, 40 minutes talking before we even started recording this because just a lot of things in common, and what a great person. Now, when I say that you were well on your way to marriage, you actually had a ring on your finger and had accepted a proposal, right?
Yeah, I'd ordered my wedding dress and made arrangements with my pastor, and we were weeks away from getting married.
And you were not exactly a teenage bride.
No,
Can I say that?
I was 39. 39 when I accepted the engagement proposal, had never been married, had a few dating relationships, in high school, but really nothing serious in that. I had some ambitions that kind of precluded my availability to be married. And so this was something that I'd hoped for and I'd waited for a really long time.
Every woman listening probably can understand that you felt a little bit of that ticking clock too. So there was probably a lot of excitement that maybe this dream that I had almost given up on is actually going to happen.
Yeah. And while I wouldn't say that was the only reason that I was excited, I definitely was cognizant of that in the back of my mind and knowing that that window was closing. And so I'd invested a lot of my life into the relationship. We dated for a few years at that point, and I certainly wasn't looking for a way out of the relationship. I was very serious about my commitment to this person.
Right, because you were not rushing to the altar to have a baby. You took your time.
Correct.
And you were truly drawn to this person. What was it that drew you to him? What made you think this is the one?
Well, I found him very attentive. We came from different backgrounds, but I found he was quite a good communicator and quite a consistent communicator. I felt very listened to, and he was generally a very kind person. So in my dating experience previously, I'd not always had that. And he was quite the gentleman throughout the lion's share of our relationship. And I felt that was very genuine, and felt that I'd vetted him pretty carefully for having dated him quite a while.
Well, yeah, because you guys had been friends for how long before you even dated?
Well over a year, for sure. So I knew him quite well. We lived in the same area, and I'd had interactions with him on a repeated basis just as friends before we started dating.
And I should mention that this was all happening in another country,
yes,
in America, and correct. You were living there and he was a native to this country.
Yes.
And we're not going to name the country just for privacy reasons, but this was a cross-cultural relationship, which you knew the language and everything. So it was comfortable to you, correct?
Yeah, I had spent a lot of my life preparing to go to this country, and so felt that I'd done much more than the average person to be prepared for an intercultural relationship. And then his English was quite good, and so I didn't think it was a communication barrier at all in terms of a linguistic one. And so I really did feel that we were being very authentic and exchanging very forward ideas about what we wanted, and that we were on the same path.
Eventually, though, you did start getting a feeling in your gut that something's not right. And everybody kind of knows what I'm talking about. What was that feeling?
When we originally met, we were, living in the same area. And there was a time during a relationship that we had to be long distance because of my travels. So when we reunited in a new location where we were planning to then live, and I was then going to be working, I immediately found that he was really super aggressive with me physically, just from the get-go, which I had not experienced when
In a
we were
sexual way or in an abusive way?
not in a physically abusive way. I think it was meant to be a sexual romantic thing, but he came on very strong and much stronger than I felt someone should when we were just reuniting. There was never any actual physical assault or sexual assault, but it was also because I was very strong and I was holding to my boundaries. So I feel like there could have been, but I rerouted that energy and, told him we're not going to do that. So he did respect that, to his credit, but still, I just felt it was more objectifying than it was uh, an affection for me in particular. And I had not experienced that with him previously. And so I don't know where that came from. I don't know if some of that was having been apart for a while, but it just seemed quite unmetered and it didn't feel good for me. It felt definitely fearful for feeling like I was close to this person, all of a sudden feeling like I needed to keep them at bay. I'll put it that way.
I think there are some women that believe, well, your body's not your own, like in a marriage situation. So you should have, maybe not you because you weren't married, but you
Right.
should have just given in. So that's why I'm kind of saying, what was he doing? Was he holding you down? Was he?
He wasn't holding me down, but he was certainly moving in such a way where I didn't anticipate him be touching me or trying to kiss me or something like that. And it almost felt as if it was maybe pornographic. Maybe he had seen something that he was trying to reenact. And it's hard to say because, one, I love this person, right? So it's not that I didn't want to be physically connected to him. I did have my boundaries. I'm not doing certain things until I'm married, and I didn't. But I think from his perspective is, how far can I go with this person? How far will they let me go? And so, for example, one of the times I remember, he, not in a forceful way, but, pushed me against the wall and tried to kiss me quite forcefully. And I wasn't ready for it. Like I didn't see it coming. And so it didn't feel loving. It felt like an ambush almost. And so that sort of thing I had to course correct. But it was sort of a repeated, well, maybe today she will be, or maybe tomorrow she will be more open to this. And I was really uncomfortable with it. At the same time, I really had very much an emotional connection to this person built up over years of communicating, and I was expecting to marry him. So I was trying to find the gray zone that was healthy, that wasn't completely puritanical, but also wasn't violating
Right.
scripture. And it was really hard to know that. And I've not, to be honest, Julie, I've dated a little bit. I've not been really physically involved with men. So there's a lot of inexperience on my part, even for my age, that I wasn't expecting this kind of behavior from a man.
On top of those physical issues, there were also some cross-cultural issues. And what was happening there?
I'd studied his culture for quite a long time, but he came from a country where he was quite unfamiliar with my culture and really anything outside of his own experience and his own nationality. And so one of the things that I think was a problem is that he didn't have any way of knowing that there are different points of view, that there are different ways of seeing the world, because the only way he could see the world is the way that he had been permitted to see the world. But for me, I think the biggest issue is I'm a very authentic, forthright person. So, for example, when we first started dating, I wanted to make sure a couple of issues were clarified that I was not going to negotiate. So, for example, the physicality. I'm not going to do certain things before we get married. And I'm letting you know that now, because if that's what you're looking for, that's not going to happen. We talked a little bit about fiscal things. We talked a little bit about international family things if we were to have children. And so I was very pointed with him. And I assumed erroneously that my being authentic was going to be reciprocated. I
Oh
think,
yeah, we're all nodding our heads.
yeah,
I remember. Yeah.
yeah. And, I think looking back in retrospect, I think the position he took is, I can tolerate this in you, but he didn't really communicate to me that he didn't hold the same position. He just planned on being tolerant of it. And so when it finally came to us getting married and, push came to shove, the rubber's hitting the road, and we're going to have to start adulting and being married, some of these issues were not theoretical anymore. They were very practical. And so whether or not he meant to mislead me, I felt misled. I felt betrayed because I thought we were on the same page on these issues that I'd been
Mhm.
very, very honest about. And he one time told me, when I finally confronted him with that as we were ending the relationship, I said, I have never lied to you. And I told you these different issues, 2-3 years ago. I never withheld that information from you. Why are you changing your mind on this? And he's like, I thought you would change your mind. The things that I was talking to my ex, though, about were like very significant, life altering issues of values. How are we going to raise our children? What are we going to do with financial planning? And then also, my own commitment to purity, sexual purity. So to me, that's the
Those are huge.
reason. Yeah, that's the reason I was very forward with them at the beginning of the relationship, because I thought, if this person isn't serious about me and is just trying to mess around, they're not going to stick around.
Right.
And he did for years. He stuck around. And I think, Julie, one of the biggest things I learned is time is not a function of being able to trust somebody. It certainly is an ingredient. I think that the longer somebody shows a pattern of good behavior or appropriate behavior, that's good. It's better to have good behavior for a year than a month. But particularly his culture, they're very patient people, and they'll try to wait you out. So I come to realize, just because we dated for so many months or years doesn't mean that this person's character is what I think it is.
Wow. Now, in all fairness, you did bring some of your own worldview into this relationship as a result of your parents.
Yes,
Do you want
for
to
sure.
explain some of that?
I was raised in a kind of interesting situation. Faith-wise, one of my parents is a believer, in Christ, and another one, who happens to be the more highly educated one, was actually a psychologist. And I think his relationship with God, or non-relationship with God, was connected to a lot of some grief and some things that had happened in his life. But the short of it is, my parents were not on the same page in worldview. And so they were raising us in that tension. For example, the parent that was not a believer did not want us to go to church, did not want the other parent to take us to church. And so I never really had a lot of direct discipleship in the Bible until I was about middle schooler. I lived in a home where my parents had very different views of the world from a religious perspective, not necessarily culturally, but definitely weren't on the same page in the things that they prioritized and valued.
How did you end up becoming a strong believer then?
That's a good question. Well, I also had some pretty serious medical issues when I was a child. I've had multiple major surgeries. I was born with a congenital defect, and at a very young age, 7 years old, I understood what my mortality was, and most children don't. As a 7-year-old, I knew I could die, and I knew I needed to be prepared for that. So my Christian parent explained the gospel to me, explained eternity to me, and helped me to accept Jesus in my heart, as we say. But I didn't really understand what it meant to follow Jesus until I went to church, and I did that completely by myself. I was a 12 or 13-year-old, and I chose the church that I'm still at 34 years later.
Wow.
Because I could walk there. So I had an experience at a vacation Bible school, not at this church, but the kid next to me kind of snickered at me that I didn't know my way around the Bible, and it hurt my feelings. And then I got mad, and I thought, well, if I'm a Christian, I better figure out what's in this book. So I started going to church by myself, and it was really against my agnostic parents' wishes. They were not happy that I was going to church.
That's a pretty incredible story. It shows your resilience and your courage from the very beginning. It's just like, that's Leah. That's who you are and who God made you to be. I think that's pretty incredible. Going back to your relationship, you're bringing in this, I am not going to be unequally yoked type of thing, because I've seen that and it doesn't work. So that's a big deal for you. And as you're beginning to start seeing these issues pop up in your relationship, a lot of couples would brush them off and say, well, relationships are hard work and we'll work through them. And what made you realize this is different?
Well, it's funny that you say that, because that line of reasoning was actually very much what my ex was arguing with me about. When I canceled our wedding, we kind of went around and around for a few months trying to negotiate the situation. And the longer we talked, the more abusive and insulting he became.
Which is not a great way to woo a woman back. I'm just,
No,
mental note for any guy that might be listening.
No, it isn't. And I mean, I think he was obviously very upset about my limit. I was not breaking up with him indefinitely. I was giving him somewhat of an ultimatum, but I wasn't doing it to give him an ultimatum. I was just saying, this is who I am. This is what I'm going to do. If I'm going to be married, this is the kind of person I'm going to marry.
So you had boundaries.
I did. And I said, and I hope that's you. And I thought it was, I thought that was you, but now you're telling me it's not who you want to be or who you actually were. So I actually gave him some time to think about what he wanted to do. And I said, for my own health, I need to not communicate with you, because we're not getting this resolved and it's upsetting me. So I waited, Julie, for about a year, because I was still in the country where he lived, hoping that he might change his mind.
And when you say change his mind, you're not talking about physical. There was a deal breaker,
right,
for you. What was that?
So a few weeks before our wedding, he had gone through some situations that were, I don't think he was being completely forthcoming with me about. Some of them were with his work, but the short of it was, it's very difficult in his culture to be a person of faith. And I think he finally decided that it was not something that he was willing to do because of the financial ramifications of them. And he did not want to follow Christ anymore. So he was, in a flash of honesty, I don't really know where it came from. I'm really grateful to God that he eventually told me that directly, because he hadn't. But he said, you can go to church, you can do all the things, but I don't want to do it. But I still want to be married. And I said, I can't do that. He was really angry at the idea of God. And I think there were things, to be honest, that had happened in his life that maybe he was grieving, and he'd been confronted with the idea of God in his adulthood. And so a lot of it he was still digesting, I think. I remember telling him it was important to me that he and I be on the same page in our thought process about church and etc., so that he went through this discipleship course. And I don't know what his experience was in there, because he really couldn't communicate it to me, I don't think, authentically. But something about it, he just didn't want to do it anymore. So whether it was more of I need to focus on making money and working, and I don't have time for this, or I'm just offended with something theologically here that I'm not willing to accept, for whatever reason, he just told me he didn't want to do the God thing, as he put it.
Didn't he also at one point say, I hate God?
He did. I've got screenshots still on my phone about how angry he was at God. And I think he pictured God as a dictator, to be honest. And he doesn't picture him as a loving, benevolent person at all. He only sees the justice side.
Which, given the culture that he was in, is not hard to imagine why he would see God that way.
Right. And he'd had some experiences even as a college student and different things where he had really abusive instructors. That is also part of their culture. And he had a lot of angerness and bitterness towards them. And I knew that because we talked about that issue a lot as we were dating, but I think he paralleled that with the idea of God. And so whether or not his church was somehow weird that he was going to his local church there in his country, I don't know if he had a negative experience at church that he then just pinned on God, or if he just, for whatever reason, changed his mind. And I still have questions, Julie, to this day.
Right.
I remember saying, I don't understand why all of a sudden you've changed your mind on this. I still don't understand.
I love the term that you said, a flash of honesty, because I think sometimes it's almost inadvertent, but we see who they truly are in these flashes of honesty, and they can really save us from a lot of pain if we're paying attention. So you just weeks before the wedding, you called it off. And I just want to take a moment and talk about the pain of that decision, because it involved a lot of grief for you. This wasn't just the wedding's off and I'm moving on. This was a lot of things are off.
Yeah. My connection to him in particular was very all-encompassing, not just because I deeply loved him and, obviously had the emotional connection, but I was immersed in his country. I lived there and my vocation was there, and I'd spent a lot of my adult life investing in my life there. And so in me being there, I didn't go there because of him. I was there previously and met him, but he became very much entwined in my experience of being in that country. And so I had to grieve not only the relationship, but eventually having to leave that place and leave my vocation there, and also my age at that time, right? I was close to 40, and I knew that probably by the time I could get to know another person to the depth that I might marry them, that window of fertility was going to close, and it did surgically later. And so I was grieving so many things within a span of 2 years. My whole world got really turned upside down, and that was on the heels of the COVID pandemic. So it was a very dark time for me.
Ever feel like your sanity depends on someone else's choices? Like their destructive patterns are slowly destroying both of you? Let me guess, you've tried everything. Praying harder, loving more, walking on eggshells, and nothing's changing except you. You're becoming someone you don't even recognize anymore. What if I told you there's a way out? A way to break free from this crazy cycle without losing your faith or your compassion? Mark your calendar. February 13th could be the day that changes everything. Leslie is offering a powerful free webinar that day, one where you'll discover why trying to fix their problem keeps you stuck, and you'll learn exactly how to break free. There are 2 times to choose from, 12:30 or 7 p.m. Eastern. Register now at leslievernick.com/OK. That's leslievernick.com/OK. Stop letting someone else's choices steal your life. Your future is waiting, and it's a good one. There's a woman listening, Leah, that's hurting, that's grieving. Talk about what that felt like, the hopelessness, the thoughts that you were feeling at that time.
Yeah, I cried. I felt like every day for probably a couple of years, Julie. There were times I had to hold it in, obviously, because I was working. But I remember one time in particular when I was still in this country, I left work, I got on the bus, and as soon as I get on the bus, immediately I just have the waterfall of tears because I'd been holding all of that emotion in for several hours, and generally cried myself to sleep almost every night for a good portion of that year and the next when I was back in the States. And some of that was cleansing. I just had to let a lot of emotion out, but it was absolutely devastating. And I did not see what good could come of it. I didn't understand it. I was very angry at God for a time because I felt like I'd done all the things that I'm supposed to
exactly.
do. Right. And
you checked off all the boxes.
Yeah,
you were a good girl.
And I'd been faithful to him in the particular situation of our relationship. And so I was really angry for a long time. I was very confused. I really wanted there to be an explanation as to why this happened, and there wasn't one.
Yeah. You eventually, in all of this grief and pain, that's when you found Leslie.
Yeah, it was around the time that I was leaving to return home to America. I think originally I actually connected around um, Lisa Turker's book, It's Not Supposed to Be This Way, which I was reading, ending the relationship that year later.
Which is a really good title for your life right there.
I was like, the book written for me, even though her story is different, it really resonated with me. And I'm not entirely sure how I found Leslie, except that probably the algorithm on Facebook and YouTube
Sure.
knew that I would
You're
be
pretty tight.
interested. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I found Leslie and I was really grateful to find her. It really helped me understand in retrospect a lot of what had happened in my relationship.
What was one of the big aha moments as you tried to heal from this breakup that you learned from her?
One of the biggest things that was an epiphany for me was the continuum of what's disappointing, what's difficult, and what's destructive. Because I went back and forth feeling like maybe I should have stayed with him. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe this was not as much of a deal breaker as I made it in my head. And when I started understanding from her materials and the podcast and a lot of the videos that there's a certain level of relationships that is just hard, right? Like relationships with two sinners is going to be hard because nobody's perfect and everyone, despite their best efforts, is going to hurt each other occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one type of problem in a relationship. But when you get to the point where there's deception or where somebody is objectifying you and they don't realize how, or they don't care how deeply their choices are hurting you, that idea of now it's destructive. I saw like my relationship started off with just being kind of, we had some differences in culture. Fine, I can negotiate some of that, but there's some things I can't, and there's some things I shouldn't. And that was an epiphany for me. It was very validating.
Validating for sure. You ended up taking some of Leslie's coaching programs, moving beyond people pleasing and walking in core strength. How did those help you?
Well, a big part of it was validation. As I said, when I heard other people's stories, I realized I wasn't crazy. I realized that I'm not the only person that's experienced these sorts of things. And in fact, there are even more difficult things that people have endured than what I had to deal with. So that was a big part of it. The support within the Facebook communities has also been a really big blessing to me, because sometimes in a moment, I really don't know what to do about a certain situation. I don't have objectivity about it. And I just need somebody that gets the type of relationship that I'm struggling with to share their experience, but also say like, yeah, that doesn't sound totally healthy, or, I see that could be a problem. And that validation plus their feedback on maybe how they've navigated a similar situation was super helpful.
Well, because each of these coaching groups, they have their own private Facebook group, and
Yes.
these are small groups, 15 women each or so. So they're getting to know you. So when they're giving you feedback, sometimes it's quite personal, which is invaluable. What were some of the core strength principles that you were able to apply to your life and you continue to use today?
Yeah. And this is even post the relationship that we just discussed, as I've encountered other, difficult relationships and situations. I would say courageously committed to the truth. The C part of core was very
Yeah,
helpful, because I really had to embody that to draw boundaries with my ex. And I felt, rather than feeling like something was wrong with me, I felt like something was right with me when
I
I was
love
like,
that.
I was courageous and I was committed to the truth, and I did it in a loving way. But I really like, Jesus was described as full of grace and truth. And I really think grace and truth are two wings on the same bird, right? Like you can't have a healthy relationship with just only one of those. You can't only be truthful and you can't only be gracious. If you don't have both, like, there's going to be a problem. So the truthful part of it was great. And then I think showing empathy without enabling would be the opposite side of that. So the E part of core, I can really understand that a person doesn't like my boundary and love them deeply and still hold the boundary. And that's been hard for me as somebody that, has been around codependent situations. But I finally realized that someone being upset with me does not make me a bad person. People were upset with Jesus and he didn't do anything wrong. So those sorts of principles of, I don't need to have everyone happy with me for me to be okay. And for me to actually have obeyed God, that was very, very helpful.
How are you different now?
I feel a real need to be married around the time that I was dating this person. Of course, it was nothing bad to want, and it's a lot of people want to be that way, and a lot of girls dream of being a bride and all that. I really felt somewhat of a badge of something must be wrong with me that I'm not married yet. And I think a lot of single women, even divorced women, probably would feel the same way. But the longer that I go and the longer that I've dated, even post this relationship, I don't feel that way anymore. It's not that I don't want to be married, but I want to be in a healthy situation more than I want to be married.
I'll never forget my dad. I was an older bride too. And my dad walked into my room one time and asked if I was gay.
What?
And I was like, oh, he did. Yeah.
I'm definitely not, by the way.
And I remember feeling devastated, like, oh my gosh, my dad thinks I'm gay. Does everybody else think that?
That's so funny you say that because just very quick quip here. When I first got to the country where I was serving, I was 34, and I went out with some local people to dinner the first day I was in my city, and they said, "You're 34? You've never been married? Isn't your family ashamed?" And that's their culture. They actually have a name for it that's quite derogatory, and I won't say it here, but I mean, to me, I have seen, like, marriage is not the be all end all of anything. And I really think that women in particular do imagine that it's a Disney thing, right? This is the fairy tale. The finish line is getting married and having kids. And that's wonderful. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. But there's also nothing wrong with being single.
There's not.
And there's loneliness. There certainly is. And there's certainly longing on certain levels. But to me, I think the difference is I don't have the biological clock ticking the way that I had it before. And I realized this is too serious of an issue to overlook something that's glaringly not healthy and not going to bode well for me, because when you see certain red flags, even yellow flags, they're not normally going to get better.
Yep.
They're either going to stay the same or they're going to get worse. And so if you don't have a pretty good start to begin with, I feel like being single is much simpler.
Yellow lights usually turn red, not green.
Yeah.
So yeah. I remember somebody one time said to me, back when I was still single, well, you can always maybe find a widower.
I've been told that too. Yeah.
Here's another sticky note for you. Just don't say anything. Just keep your mouth shut.
Well, and I think that's particular to women, as you mentioned too, because for some reason women have been told that a lot of their value is in their physical attractiveness, and also their ability to bear children, which is a wonderful blessing. Nothing wrong with that. But their identity is so tied to that. And I think if your identity is tied to only that, even it doesn't even have to be an abusive situation. It could just be a loss. And if you don't have those things that make you, if that's what your identity is tied to, then who are you? And that is what's different, is that I know who I am, whether or not I'm married, and I will be the same person if I ever do get married as I am right now.
I don't think there's anything to add to that, Leah.
Well, thanks.
I really don't. If there's one piece of advice that you would want to give to a listener, as far as, what you've learned, what your non-negotiables are, one lesson that you would say, this is most important in my life, what would it be?
Well, in terms of navigating relationships that are difficult, I think the most important thing I got was having support around me and healthy support. And I had a lot of different things, including Leslie's materials and programs. But I noticed that people that are in difficult situations tend to isolate. And I feel like that's the exact wrong thing to do. Um, it's sometimes tempting when you feel embarrassed or you feel like you're trying to protect someone else's reputation to not share. And you shouldn't share just with anybody, but you have to have somebody else's voice that you can trust in your head besides your own in order to have clarity. So that's part of core strength too, right? Being open to wise others and just knowing that you're not alone in a situation and that this one person is not your whole life, that other people care about you too and are going to support you too. That's probably the biggest thing that I would recommend.
Walking in core strength, man.
Yeah, for sure.
Leah, thank you. This has really been a pleasure, and I really wish you all the best.
Thank you, Julie.
Ever feel like your sanity depends on someone else's choices? Like their destructive patterns are slowly destroying both of you? Let me guess, you've tried everything. Praying harder, loving more, walking on eggshells, and nothing's changing except you. You're becoming someone you don't even recognize anymore. What if I told you there's a way out? A way to break free from this crazy cycle without losing your faith or your compassion. Mark your calendar. February 13th could be the day that changes everything. Leslie is offering a powerful free webinar that day, one where you'll discover why trying to fix their problem keeps you stuck, and you'll learn exactly how to break free. There are 2 times to choose from, 12:30 or 7 p.m. Eastern. Register now at leslievernick.com/OK. That's leslievernick.com/OK. Stop letting someone else's choices steal your life. Your future is waiting, and it's a good one. Thanks for joining us on Relationship Truth Unfiltered. Listen, if you're drowning in someone else's destructive patterns and you're ready for real change, don't miss our free webinar on February 13th. This isn't just another webinar. It's your chance to finally break free from the crazy cycle that's stealing your life. Register now at leslievernick.com/OK. Choose 12:30 or 7. Until next time. May God bless all of your relationships with Him, with others. p.m. Eastern. Your future self will thank you. And with yourself.